Hey everyone, welcome back to Lunar History. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and downright peculiar corners of history of Victorian fashion. You might think modern fashion trends are strange, but the 19th century truly took style to an entirely new level of extravagance, discomfort, and drama. This wasn't just about getting dressed, it was about turning everyday life into a performance. With outfits so complicated that they could challenge both your patience and your lung capacity. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy quirky history stories told in a way that keeps you curious until the very end. Your support really helps this channel grow, and it lets me keep creating more of these late-night journeys into the past. Plus, if you ring that little bell icon, you'll never miss when a new story drops, perfect for those evenings when you want history that feels anything but boring. Now, picture this. It's a crisp morning in Victorian London. The sun is peeking through heavy curtains, the air is cold, and your day is about to start with one of the most exhausting routines imaginable: getting dressed. Not just slipping into a shirt and pants, but layering yourself into a fortress of fabric, steel, and whalebone. For women, this could mean corsets pulled tight enough to challenge your spine, skirts so wide you couldn't fit through a doorway, and hats decorated with entire bird species. For men, it was collars so stiff they could double as weapons, trousers that sat nearly at your chest, and top hats that shouted status louder than any introduction could. Why did people put themselves through this? Because clothing wasn't just clothing, it was social armor. Every ruffle, every button, every perfectly polished shoe carried meaning. Fashion told the world who you were, where you belonged, and whether you understood the unspoken rules of Victorian society. Breaking those rules wasn't just embarrassing, it could ruin your reputation. Imagine being whispered about at dinner parties simply because your gloves were the wrong color or your skirt wasn't wide enough. But here's the thing, as absurd as it all seems to us today, there's something strangely captivating about this era. Victorian fashion wasn't just bizarre. It was bold, theatrical, and full of contradictions. It was beauty laced with discomfort, elegance tangled with impracticality, and identity wrapped in layers of fabric. Behind every corset string and every plume of perfume, there were real people trying to navigate a world that demanded appearance above all else. So, stay with me as we peel back the layers, literally, on what it meant to dress, live, and survive in Victorian style. By the end, you might just appreciate your sweatpants a little more. And you'll definitely understand why Victorian fashion remains one of history's most unforgettable spectacles. Ready? Let's step back in time. To truly understand why Victorian fashion still captures our imagination today, you have to step into the world of the 19th century, where appearance was not merely about clothing, but a language of its own. And every layer, every stitch, every accessory was a carefully chosen signal designed to announce one's status, refinement, and adherence to social codes that were often as suffocating as the garments themselves. It was an age when overdressing was not simply common, but expected, when the idea of moderation seemed almost scandalous, and when the act of getting dressed was closer to preparing for battle than to a casual start to the day. Imagine standing in your chilly bedroom as the first light of morning filters through thick curtains, your breath visible in the air, and knowing that before you could greet the day, you would have to transform your body into the accepted silhouette of your time man ideal, so demanding and peculiar that it often left people gasping for air or staggering under the weight of fabric. Victorian fashion was not just clothing. It was a performance of social identity, a constant reminder that the body itself was a canvas to be shaped, controlled, and displayed according to the shifting whims of etiquette and trend. Women endured corsets that pressed their ribs into unnatural shapes, garments so tight that fainting became almost fashionable in itself, while skirts ballooned outward with the help of crinolines and endless petticoats, until simply walking across a room became a complicated dance of balance and calculation. Men, though perhaps spared from skirts and corsets, were no less imprisoned by their starched collars, stiff waistcoats, and high-shined shoes, all conspiring to transform them into living statues of propriety, unable to slouch, bend, or even take a deep breath without risking their carefully composed appearance. The bizarre quality of Victorian style did not arise by accident, but grew out of a culture obsessed with coarse appearances and the idea that one's worth could be measured by how well one conformed to visual expectations. Beauty standards reached extremes that feel almost theatrical today. A woman's waist was celebrated not for strength or health, but for how tightly it could be reduced to resemble an hourglass, while pale skin was so prized that powders laced with toxic substances became daily rituals. And men cultivated elaborate facial hair or towering hats that made them appear taller, grander, and more dignified than their natural frames might allow. Every article of clothing served as both a shield and a signal, simultaneously protecting the wearer from social judgment and broadcasting to the world that they knew the rules of the game, that they belonged in polite society, and that they could afford to suffer in style. What makes it all the more fascinating is how ordinary these extremes became for the Victorians themselves. What we see as bizarre, they accepted as necessary, even desirable. To them, discomfort was not an unfortunate side effect, but almost a requirement, proof that they were refined enough to rise above mere practicality. And so, each morning began with laces, pulled tighter collars, starched stiffer skirts, made wider shoes, polished brighter, all in pursuit of an appearance that projected dignity, respectability, and control, even as the people inside the clothing struggled to breathe, to move, and sometimes even to remain conscious. Victorian fashion, in all its strange glory, was less about dressing the body than about reshaping the very idea of identity itself. It's a reminder that in this peculiar world, looking respectable was often more important than living comfortably. If you were to step into the private world of a Victorian household at the start of the day, you would quickly discover that the act of dressing oneself was not a simple necessity to be completed in haste, but rather a grand ceremony of preparation, a performance that often demanded the help of others, and a process that could easily consume more time and energy than many of our modern morning routines combined. For the Victorians, getting dressed was never about putting on a comfortable shirt or slipping into a pair of trousers in a matter of minutes, but about entering into an elaborate sequence of steps that transformed an ordinary body into a carefully sculpted image of respectability. The very first layer was never the last, and each garment that followed carried both symbolic meaning and very real physical weight, building upon one another until the wearer was no longer simply clothed, but encased almost like a figure being assembled piece by piece till they matched the precise silhouette demanded by society. What made this ritual particularly striking was the level of assistance it required. A well-to-do woman could not hope to achieve the proper fit of her corset, the fastening of the countless hooks and buttons, or the careful arrangement of skirts and petticoats without a maid, a sister, or even her mother pulling, tugging, and smoothing every layer into place with the precision of a stagehand preparing an actress for her entrance. Even men who might appear to have simpler wardrobes were not immune to this complexity. The starching of collars, the tying of cravats, and the buttoning of waistcoats often called for both dexterity and patience, with the result that one did not merely dress, but endured a kind of initiation. Each morning before stepping into public life, the body itself became secondary to the garments, for once dressed, a person was no longer free to move as they pleased, but bound by the restrictions of fabric and fashion. Their movements dictated by the stiffness of cloth and the unforgiving lines of tailoring. It is difficult to overstate the length of time this consumed. Where today we might complain about the delay of a zipper or the misplacement of a favorite shirt, the Victorians faced hours of preparation simply to appear presentable for the day's activities. Each garment had to be laid out, inspected for cleanliness and damage, chosen carefully for its suitability to the time of day and occasion. and then layered in a sequence that could not be altered without causing disaster. Stockings and shifts gave way to corsets and petticoats, which in turn supported gowns with hundreds of tiny buttons or coats tailored so tightly that breathing deeply became a luxury. Shoes, gloves, and hats completed the transformation. And by the time one was finally ready to step outside the door, the sun had often climbed considerably higher in the sky, marking not the start of a carefree day, but the end of a strenuous ritual that left many already fatigued before the first meal. This elaborate process served more than vanity. It was a constant reinforcement of the values of the age, where discipline, control, and appearances mattered above comfort or efficiency. Dressing was a way of announcing to the world that one belonged to civilization, that one respected the codes of propriety, and that one was willing to endure inconvenience and even physical hardship in the service of status and respectability. Every layer was a reminder that life in the Victorian era was not about ease, but about spectacle, and that even the most private of tasks could become a performance for an imagined audience of neighbors, relatives, and society at large. To rise in the morning was to accept this challenge, to submit once more to the elaborate ritual of clothing that would shape not only your body, but also your place in the world. The complexity of the Victorian wardrobe became even more astonishing when one looked closely at the sheer number of layers that a woman was expected to wear before she could consider herself properly dressed. For this was not a matter of slipping into a single gown or fastening a dress with ease, but of submitting to a ritual in which each piece of fabric was strategically added in order to sculpt, conceal, and ultimately transform the body into a vision that society deemed respectable. It began with the chemise, a seemingly plain garment of linen or cotton that acted as the first barrier between the skin and the many layers to follow. And though it might appear simple, its role was essential, for it absorbed sweat, protected more expensive fabrics, and preserved the modesty of a lady who was never to appear in anything less. Over this humble shift came the corset, and here the transformation truly began as whalebone or steel stays were laced so tightly around the torso that breathing became shallow. The waist shrank by several inches, and the body itself was reshaped into an idealized, hourglass figure that bore little resemblance to natural anatomy. Once the corset had been secured, the next addition was the crinoline, a remarkable contraption of hoops and fabric that expanded the skirt outward to a vast circular shape, sometimes so wide that passing through a doorway required calculation and patience. The crinoline was more than an undergarment. It was a statement of wealth and leisure, for no woman dressed in such an extravagant structure could possibly be expected to perform ordinary labor. To soften and disguise the rigid lines of the crinoline, layer upon layer of petticoats were added, each one heavier, scratchier, and warmer than the last, until the wearer was encased in a cloud of fabric that rustled with every movement. These petticoats not only provided volume, but also conveyed respectability, for to appear with a skirt lacking sufficient fullness was to risk whispers of negligence, or worse, poverty. By this point, the body was already weighed down and overheated, yet the process was only halfway complete. The bodice followed a stiff, tightly fitted garment designed to hold the upper body firmly in place, to support posture, and to present the torso as smooth and upright as possible, with dozens of buttons or hooks that often required nimble fingers to fasten. Its construction meant that a woman could not slouch, bend easily, or even raise her arms without difficulty. For the bodice was as much a cage as it was a garment, demanding constant composure and graceful bearing. And finally came the bustle, introduced later in the century, an exaggerated framework worn at the back of the skirt that lifted and projected the fabric outward, creating a silhouette in which the waist appeared impossibly small and the rear extravagantly pronounced. This curious shape, both admired and ridiculed in its own time, completed the ensemble, and with it, the woman's figure was no longer her own, but a carefully engineered work of fashion architecture. By the end of this ritual, The wearer had become a living sculpture of fabric, steel, and lace, a figure that projected elegance and refinement, but at the cost of freedom of movement, comfort, and often health. Walking, sitting, and even breathing required thought and restraint, and yet the discomfort was not seen as a flaw, but as a mark of dignity and refinement. Proof that one had the means to endure impracticality in the service of fashion. To modern eyes, these layers might appear excessive, almost theatrical, but to the Victorians, they were simply the price of respectability. A daily reminder that life was meant to be lived in costume, and that one's true self was always hidden beneath the elaborate disguise of society's expectations. To understand the heart of Victorian fashion, one must linger on the corset. For it was not merely a garment, but the very foundation upon which the entire silhouette of the era was built, a structure designed with such determination that it reshaped flesh, bone, and breath itself in order to achieve the prized hourglass figure. When a young woman stepped into her corset, she was not simply putting on clothing, but consenting to a daily ritual of restriction. It's an act that demanded another's assistance, since the laces were pulled so firmly that the wearer could not hope to manage them alone. The tightening began gently with a few tugs to align the garment, and then came the decisive pulls, each one drawing the waist smaller and smaller until ribs creaked, lungs protested, and the body itself seemed to surrender to the will of fashion. For many women, the moment the corset was fully secured was the moment the day truly began. For from that point onward, every movement, every gesture, even every breath was dictated by its unyielding grip. The corset was meant to promise elegance, yet its price was discomfort of the most intimate kind, and though fainting couches became common fixtures in parlors, they were not always signs of delicate sensibility, but practical necessities for bodies denied full access to air. Doctors occasionally warned of crushed ribs, displaced organs, and digestive troubles, but these cautions were often ignored or dismissed as exaggerations, for society valued the wasp waist more than it valued health. To achieve a waist that measured a mere 18 or 20 inches was to achieve admiration. And so the whispers of risk did little to dissuade those who were eager to embody the fashionable ideal. Even young girls were introduced to corsets early, conditioned to believe that beauty required discipline, and that to stand tall, poised, and respectable meant enduring the slow reshaping of one's body year after year. Yet the corset was not only physical, it was psychological, reminding its wearer at every moment that she was being observed, judged, and valued by how closely her body matched an artificial shape. To sit required composure, to walk demanded grace, and to eat required restraint, for the stomach pressed against rigid stays could hold only the smallest of meals. A hearty laugh, a sudden sneeze, or a deep sigh could feel dangerous, and so women learned to temper even their expressions of emotion in order to preserve both dignity and breath. In this way, the corset was not only a garment, but a form of training shaping behavior as well as form, ensuring that a woman's posture, movements, and even her demeanor reflected the ideals of control and refinement that the age so prized. And yet, despite its hardships, many women defended the corset, claiming it provided support, improved posture, and gave them confidence by presenting their bodies in a way society admired. To remove the corset entirely was unthinkable for those who wished to be seen as respectable, for without it, the dress could not sit properly. The bodice could not close smoothly, and the entire silhouette would collapse. Thus, the corset became indispensable, the hidden but ever-present skeleton of Victorian fashion, a device that turned ordinary bodies into the idealized forms celebrated in portraits and admired in drawing rooms. It was at once a tool of beauty and a symbol of constraint. And while it granted its wearer the outward appearance of elegance, it also reminded her, with every shallow breath and every careful step, that in the world of Victorian fashion, even the act of existing was to be shaped, bound, and controlled. If the corset was the unseen foundation of the Victorian silhouette, the crinoline was its most dramatic outward expression. For nothing declared fashion and status more boldly than a skirt that expanded into a vast circle of steel, hoops, and fabric, transforming the wearer into a moving piece of architecture whose presence could not be ignored. To step into a crinoline was to step into a cage of one's own, making a contraption of well-boned steel or cane arranged in concentric hoops that grew wider with each ring until the skirt reached such proportions that a woman might easily take up the space of a small parlor on her own. What had begun as a modest means of supporting fabric evolved into a spectacle so large that newspapers joked about women blocking entire church pews or sweeping objects off tables simply by turning too quickly, and while the sight must have been magnificent to behold, it carried with it challenges that made daily life a constant negotiation with gravity, geometry, and dignity. Once dressed in a crinoline, a woman no longer simply walked. She navigated, her steps hidden beneath the great circle of fabric, her feet reduced to invisible engines powering the grand structure above. Doorways, once simple thresholds, became adversaries that demanded sideways maneuvers, careful angling, and the occasional pause to prevent the frame from catching and springing back like a rebellious cell. Staircases offered their own perils, for ascending meant feeling the entire cage tilt and sway behind you, while descending risked having the crinoline push forward as though eager to reach the bottom before its owner did. Even the act of sitting required calculation. Chairs had to be located, skirts carefully gathered, and the descent made slowly, lest the frame collapse backward and reveal more than modesty would allow. Accidents, unsurprisingly, were not rare. Servants were known to be trapped between skirts during crowded gatherings. Children and pets sometimes vanished beneath the folds only to reappear elsewhere, and the unfortunate tendency of the hoops to catch on furniture or banisters meant that a sudden move could send entire trays of food tumbling or decorative vases shattering to the floor. There were even reports of women as crinolines catching fire when the enormous skirts brushed too closely to open flames. A hazard in households where candles and fireplaces were everywhere. And yet, despite the dangers, the crinoline flourished because its very impracticality was part of its power. A woman encased in such an elaborate cage could not possibly be expected to work to bend or to rush. She existed instead as a figure of leisure, grace, and extravagance, floating rather than walking, commanding space wherever she went. What is perhaps most remarkable is how quickly society adapted to this strange spectacle. Etiquette guides offered advice on how to manage the width of one's skirt without offending others. Cartoons poked fun at the possible dimensions. And yet, the fashion endured, driven by the belief that the wider the skirt, the greater the impression of wealth and refinement. It was as though women had become planets in orbit, their garments sweeping through parlors, theaters, streets with the force of their own gravitational pull. And so, despite the bruised shins, toppled furniture, and whispered jokes, the crinoline reigned as one of the most iconic and unforgettable symbols of Victorian fashion, a reminder that in this age, beauty was measured not by ease or practicality, but by how much space you could command with every swish of fabric and every calculated step. As if the crinoline alone were not a formidable enough structure, the Victorians added yet another burden in the form of endless petticoats layered one upon another until the sheer volume of fabric created a garment as heavy as it was symbolic. To modernize the idea of wearing multiple underskirts beneath a cage of steel hoops may appear absurd, but in the 19th century it was considered essential for petticoats where not simply fabric meant to add softness or warmth. They were markers of wealth, propriety, and status, and the more layers one could bear, the more refined one appeared. A skirt without sufficient fullness risked looking limp or neglected, and that would never do in a society where every detail of appearance was scrutinized for meaning. Thus, women endured the sweltering heat of summer afternoons, wrapped in yards upon yards of starched cotton or wool, each petticoat adding its own scratchiness, its own drag against the skin, and its own small reminder that fashion demanded sacrifice. The weight of these garments was considerable. Many women found themselves exhausted simply from carrying the mass of fabric about their day. Walking with such layers meant lifting not only the outer dress, but also the crinoline and the petticoats beneath, each layer resisting movement like a stubborn tide. While stairs became challenges that required gathering armfuls of skirts and lifting them high enough to prevent stumbling. The constant friction of so much cloth rubbing together created unexpected consequences as well. Static shocks were not unheard of, and a faint crackle might sometimes follow the swish of a skirt, as though the very air objected to so much fabric. Meanwhile, the starched hems and stiffened layers scraped against sensitive skin, producing rashes, irritation, and an itch that could never be properly relieved in polite company. Yet to complain was to risk appearing frivolous, for the burden of the petticoat was understood as part of the duty of refinement. Beyond the physical discomfort, the symbolism of the petticoat was undeniable. To own many was to signal prosperity, for such fabric required not only money, but also servants to wash, starch, and iron the endless folds. A woman who rustled when she walked was a woman announcing her place in the social hierarchy. Her very movement whispering of leisure and respectability. The petticoats filled the air with sound and motion, creating a presence that extended beyond the body itself, so that even before a lady was seen, she might be heard approaching in the rhythmic swish of her skirts. These layers served as a kind of armor, not of steel, but of propriety, reminding all who saw her that she was shielded by wealth and etiquette as firmly as by fabric. Still, the realities of living in such clothing could never be ignored. Summer heat turned the petticoats into ovens. Winter damp made them heavy and cold. And the constant drag against the body sapped energy until even the simplest tasks felt monumental. Yet women persisted, convinced that to appear without the right number of layers was to risk judgment, gossip, or exclusion from the ranks of the respectable. In this way, the petticoat was more than a garment. It was a daily lesson in endurance, a visible sign of invisible social pressures, and a perfect example of how Victorian fashion blurred the line between beauty and burden. By the time a woman was fully dressed, she carried not only the weight of fabric, but also the weight of expectation. Each petticoat rustling with the unspoken reminder that in her world, comfort was far less valuable than the appearance of propriety. After the layers of chemises, corsets, crinolines, and petticoats had done their work in reshaping the female form, the finishing touches of the bodice and bustle arrived to transform the silhouette into something so stylized, so theatrical, that the natural body beneath was almost entirely unrecognizable. The bodice, with its stiff fabrics and precise tailoring, was never merely a top garment, but rather a sculpting device, forcing the torso into the rigid lines of the prized hourglass figure. Its seams, darts, and boning smoothed the front of the body until the chest and waist appeared immovable, and its tight closures made slouching impossible, compelling the wearer to stand tall with the posture of a statue. Each button fastened, each hook secured, added another layer of restraint, and when the final fastening was in place, the body was locked into a shape designed not for comfort, but for admiration. The bodice was a declaration, the waist small, the shoulders upright. The chest lifted all evidence of a woman who could afford the discipline demanded by fashion. But it was the bustle that turned the silhouette from restrictive elegance into near caricature, exaggerating the curve of the backside until the female figure seemed to defy balance itself. Introduced in the latter half of the century, the bustle replaced the full circular spread of the crinoline with a new emphasis, projecting fabric outward at the back in layers so exaggerated that caricaturists delighted in comparing women to teapots, armchairs, or even architectural features constructed from pads, wireframes, or even springs. The bustle could range from modest to outlandish, growing so large in some fashions that it forced women to lean slightly forward when walking as though dragged backward by their own clothing. This curious shape was not accidental, for it drew the eye immediately to the lower half of the figure, creating the illusion of a dramatically narrow waist above it and making the woman's presence impossible to ignore. The symbolism of the bustle was as important as its shape. To wear such a conspicuous and impractical contraption was to declare that one lived a life of leisure, untouched by the demands of physical work. A woman could not bend easily, could not hurry down a street, could not perform even the smallest household task without difficulty. And that was precisely the point. Her very clothing testified that she had servants to labor on her behalf, that she moved in circles where display mattered more than practicality, and that her body was itself an ornament to be admired. The exaggerated rear was also a status symbol in its own right, suggesting vitality, fertility, and desirability, though cloaked in the polite language of refinement and style. Yet, as impractical as the bustle was, many women embraced it eagerly, finding in its absurd proportions a strange sense of power. To glide into a ballroom with skirts billowing behind like a theatrical curtain was to command attention, to ensure every eye in the room followed your entrance. For others, the bustle was endured less happily, resented for the way it turned walking into a performance of balance and caution, yet accepted as a non-negotiable demand of fashion. Either way, the bodice and bustle completed the transformation, leaving the wearer not merely dressed, but sculpted into a vision of Victorian femininity that was equal parts elegance and distortion. Together, they demonstrate the paradox at the heart of the era's fashion, a relentless pursuit of beauty through discomfort, a celebration of the artificial silhouette over the natural form, and a society willing to reshape women's bodies into whatever design the age declared fashionable, while the attention of history often lingers on the elaborate trials of women's clothing. The truth is that men of the Victorian age were also bound tightly by the dictates of fashion for their wardrobes. Though less flamboyant in appearance, were no less restrictive in practice, and every detail of their attire demanded the same sacrifice of comfort in favor of propriety. The male silhouette may not have required hoops, bustles, or corsets, but it was equally imprisoned by its own devices, stiff collars that pressed against the neck like unyielding blades, shirts starched to such severity that the fabric scraped against the skin, and waistcoats and jackets cut so precisely that even a slight expansion of the chest could strain the seams. The trousers, tailored high and narrow, clung uncomfortably to the legs and waist, and though they might project an image of sharp refinement, they left little room for freedom of movement. For the Victorian gentleman, every step into public life was also a step into his costume, one that demanded constant vigilance to maintain. The notorious collars, often referred to by satirists as father killers, deserved particular attention, for their stiffness was legendary, crafted from layers of fabric so heavily starched that the edges pressed against the jawline and throat until a man could neither turn his head easily nor lower his chin without discomfort. Some were so high and unyielding that swallowing became a conscious act, and though they lent the neck an appearance of authority and dignity, they also left the wearer with the perpetual sensation of being trapped in his own clothing. The shirts beneath these collars were no reprieve, for starching was a matter of pride, and a limp or wrinkled shirt would have been considered disgraceful. The crispness of fabric was equated with the crispness of character, so men submitted to garments that scratched, restricted, and chafed, lest they risk being seen as careless or unmanly. Over these came the waistcoat and jacket, which together completed the formal uniform of the respectable man. The waistcoat, snugly fitted and buttoned, ensured that the torso appeared trim and composed, while the jacket, often tailored to emphasize a broad chest and narrow waist, added yet another layer of heat and immobility. In winter, multiple layers were piled one upon another until the weight of clothing itself became burdensome, while in summer, men sweltered beneath wool and starch with no acceptable means of relief, since to shed layers in public was to risk impropriety. The image of the gentleman demanded not ease but discipline, and to appear polished was to endure silently whatever discomfort came with the clothing. Even the trousers, which might appear simple, carried their own restrictions. Cut to fit closely and secured high on the waist. They left little room for sitting comfortably, and the rigid seams often pressed into the body with unforgiving precision. To bend or crouch required careful management, and to sit for long periods was to accept the nagging discomfort of fabric that refused to yield. Polished shoes completed the ensemble, narrow and stiff, often causing blisters or pinching, but always gleaming to project the proper image of refinement. The overall effect was that of a walking statue, a figure encased not in steel and fabric like his female counterpart, but in starch and tailoring, every line of his clothing announcing that he was in control of himself, his appearance, and by extension, his place in the world. In truth, however, the Victorian gentleman was just as much a prisoner of fashion as the Victorian lady. Condemned to garments that demanded constant composure and denied him the simplest luxury of comfort. Together, men and women played their parts on the stage of society, their clothing, both costume and cage, their bodies, reshaped and restrained by rules of style that valued image above ease. And in this shared endurance lay one of the strangest truths of the age, that everyone, regardless of gender, was bound by fabric and formed into roles as rigid as the clothes they wore. No outfit of the Victorian age could ever be considered complete without the crowning touch of headwear, for both men and women carried on their heads not merely protection from the elements, but visible emblems of status, taste, and respectability. The top hat for men and the bonnet or elaborate hat for women were not accessories in the modern sense, but central pieces of attire, as vital to one's social image as a corset or waistcoat, and to appear in public without them was to risk being judged careless, uncultured, or even improper. The top hat, rising high above the head in its glossy severity, was more than a fashion item. It was a monument to masculinity and authority, projecting power, stability, and financial success. Its tall, cylindrical form elongated the figure, making a man appear grander and more commanding, and its shine, maintained through careful brushing and polishing, reflected not only the light, but also the discipline of the wearer. In a crowded street, a forest of top hats proclaimed the presence of gentlemen, each hat a silent assertion of social standing. For women, the matter of headwear was far more elaborate and theatrical. Bonnets began the century as modest frames that shielded the face, tied securely beneath the chin with ribbons. But as decades passed, they grew increasingly adorned, evolving into canvases upon which milliners displayed their artistry. Feathers were a common choice, often arranged in cascading arcs that gave the impression of movement even when the wearer stood still, and flowers, whether made from silk or plucked from gardens, were carefully wired and stitched into place, blooming perpetually atop a lady's head. In some cases, extravagance pushed the boundary of imagination. Entire birds, wings outstretched as if frozen mid-flight, were perched upon hats, signaling not only fashion, daring, but also wealth, since such adornments were costly and delicate. To wear such a creation was to carry an entire spectacle above one's brow, a statement that no detail of appearance had been left to chance. The symbolism of these hats went beyond decoration. A woman's bonnet could signal her marital status, her mourning, or her participation in a particular social event. Its ribbons, veils, and colors, each carrying meaning understood by those trained in the codes of society. A modest bonnet in black signaled respect and sobriety, while a bright hat adorned with exotic feathers suggested confidence, prosperity, and a flair for drama. Men's top hats, meanwhile, were no less communicative. The quality of the silk, the height of the crown, even the angle at which it was worn, could alter the impression one gave, for these details were read like a silent language of class and confidence. And yet, behind the grandeur, practical difficulties lurked. Top hats, tall and heavy, often caught the wind and had to be held in place, while bonnets with their extravagant trimmings could limit a woman's vision or leave her neck aching beneath their weight. Despite this, neither men nor women dared abandon their headwear, for to appear bareheaded in polite company was unthinkable. Thus, every outing became not only a test of balance and posture, but also an act of presentation, for the hat was the first thing seen in a crowd, and often the detail most remembered. In this way, the top hat and the bonnet became more than mere clothing. They were declarations of identity, wearable proclamations that placed their owners firmly within the intricate web of Victorian society, where nothing, not even the smallest feather or the tallest crown of silk, was without meaning. Among the countless details that made Victorian fashion both fascinating and impractical, few accessories captured the imagination quite like the hatpin, a deceptively simple object that began as a practical necessity but soon grew into a cultural symbol, admired, feared, and endlessly debated. Women's hats of the period, often enormous creations laden with ribbons, feathers, flowers, and even entire birds, required more than a few delicate ribbons beneath the chin to hold them securely in place. Cute the hatpin, a long, slender piece of metal tipped with a decorative head, which could pierce through the hat and into the coiled hair beneath, anchoring the extravagant structure firmly so that no gust of wind or sudden movement could send it flying down the street. On the surface, it was an accessory of elegance and utility, a quiet companion to the towering bonnets and wide-brimmed hats that crowned the era's fashions. Yet in practice, the hatpin carried an edge literally that made it far more than an ornament. As hats grew larger and more elaborate, so too did the pins required to secure them, and by the late 19th century, hatpins often reached lengths of 10 to 12 inches, long enough to extend well beyond the hair and hat they were meant to support. This simple fact gave rise to an unexpected duality. While their primary purpose was to keep fashion in place, they could, when circumstances demanded, serve as formidable tools of defense. A woman walking alone through a crowded street, pressed in by strangers, or threatened by unwanted attention, had within reach a ready-made weapon, sharp, strong, and inconspicuous until the moment it was needed. Stories circulated in newspapers of women using their hatpins to fend off aggressors, pricking hands that strayed too close, or striking at those who mistook fashion for vulnerability. Such tales, whether exaggerated or true, added to the mystique of the hatpin, elevating it from mere accessory to symbol of a woman's ability to protect herself in a society that often offered her little else in the way of defense. But with this practicality came controversy, as more reports surfaced of hatpins being used in moments of desperation. Critics began to argue that they posed a danger not just to ill-intentioned strangers, but to polite society itself. Debates arose in city councils and newspapers about whether these pins should be regulated, their length restricted, or their use curtailed. Some saw them as concealed weapons, dangerous blades hidden beneath the guise of fashion, and worried about the implications of women carrying them so freely. Others defended them passionately, arguing that the hatpin was not only harmless when used properly, but also a rare equalizer, giving women a measure of security in public spaces where men had long carried walking sticks or pocket knives without censure. What is most striking is how this debate revealed the tensions of the age. The hatpin embodied both beauty and menace, fragility and power, fashion and rebellion. For the women who wore them, the pins were part of the daily ritual of dressing slipped into hair without a second thought. Yet, they also offered a subtle reassurance, a hidden promise that even within the confines of rigid etiquette and restrictive clothing, there remained one small, sharp reminder of autonomy. In this way, the hatpin became more than just a fastening tool. It was a silent protest, a tiny, weaponized flourish in a world where clothing so often symbolized control. Every glint of metal beneath a feathered brim carried with it both elegance and potential defiance, making the hatpin one of the most paradoxical and compelling details of Victorian fashion. If the hatpin served as a hidden weapon disguised as fashion, the glove stood as the visible emblem of etiquette. For in Victorian society, the state of one's hands was considered inseparable from the state of one's character. Gloves were not optional accessories, but mandatory markers of refinement, and the rules that governed them were as intricate and unyielding as the garments that wrapped the rest of the body. To leave the house without gloves was unthinkable, an act that risked whispers and disapproval, for the ungloved hand suggested a lack of discipline, an exposure of raw humanity in a world where every surface of the self was expected to be curated and controlled. Thus, from morning until night, men and women alike encased their hands in leather. Silk, cotton, or lace, each material chosen to match the occasion, the season, and the hour of the day. Yet, what might sound simple in theory quickly became another layer of ritual in practice. There were strict dictates on when gloves should remain on and when they could be removed, each moment requiring judgment and memory. At a social call, one might enter with gloves on, remove them for tea, and then slip them back on again before departing. The act itself a kind of silent choreography that revealed one's mastery of etiquette. At the dinner table, gloves were to be removed discreetly, yet they must never be left in a pile, for they had to be folded neatly and placed across one's lap. At dances, women kept their gloves on during introductions and the first steps of the waltz, but a gentleman might politely request that a lady remove one if the fabric made it too slippery to hold her hand. Each setting demanded its own code, and failure to follow the rules marked one not as charmingly careless, but as ignorant, a far graver offense in a society obsessed with appearances. The irony, of course, was that gloves made the simplest tasks needlessly difficult. Fingers encased in tight kid leather could hardly grasp a small object, count coins, or untie a knot, and yet one was expected to move with effortless grace, concealing the struggle beneath an air of composure. Women, in particular, found themselves fumbling with hairpins, fans, and calling cards. Their dexterity sacrificed to fashion's demand for modesty and refinement. The glove smoothed away individuality as well, for no matter the hand beneath scarred, freckled, or calloused once gloved, it became uniform, stripped of its personal story and made to conform to the collective ideal of elegance. Still, gloves were not only instruments of discomfort. They were also instruments of communication. A finely made pair suggested wealth and taste, while a worn or ill-fitting pair betrayed carelessness or financial strain. The act of removing a glove could carry subtle meaning too, from the formality of a handshake to the intimacy of revealing bare skin in a world that prized concealment. Even colors spoke volumes. White gloves denoted purity and formality. Black gloves were reserved for mourning, and bright shades risked accusations of vanity. Through these unspoken signals, gloves became a language of their own, silent but eloquent, shaping interactions as surely as words. Thus, though they bound their hands and reduced functionality, gloves offered their wearers something intangible, the security of belonging, the assurance that they moved within the boundaries of respectability, and the satisfaction of playing their role correctly in the elaborate drama of Victorian life. They were cages in miniature, soft prisons of silk or leather. Yet they were worn willingly, for to discard them was to risk more than freedom. It was to risk reputation itself. After gloves had concealed the hands in layers of silk, lace, or leather, it was the feet that bore the final burden of Victorian fashion. And here too, appearance triumphed mercilessly over comfort. Shoes and boots of the period were crafted with painstaking attention to detail, polished to perfection, and shaped to convey elegance and refinement. Yet, rarely did they take into account the natural form of the human foot. Narrow toes, stiff leather, and unforgiving construction forced the feet into unnatural positions. And while they may have completed the outfit with grace, they often left the wearer in silent misery. To walk through the day in such footwear was to endure a slow torture, a constant reminder that beauty and respectability demanded sacrifice from head to toe, quite literally. The most fashionable shoes for women were pointed and dainty, designed to create the illusion of a delicate step, even if the woman inside them was struggling with every pace. High-button boots became particularly popular, their dozens of tiny fastenings requiring a button hook and considerable patience to secure. But once closed, they locked the foot and ankle in place so firmly that flexibility vanished. For men, boots and dress shoes carried their own hardships. The desire for a sleek, narrow profile led to designs that pinched toes and pressed cruelly against the sides of the feet, all while polished leather demanded constant upkeep to maintain its lustrous sheen. The result was footwear that looked impeccable from the outside, yet inflicted slow, grinding pain with each stride. Over time, the physical consequences became undeniable. Medical records and accounts from the period describe widespread foot deformities, corns, hammer toes, and calluses that plagued both men and women who had submitted to the dictates of fashion. These were not occasional inconveniences, but lifelong afflictions, carried as unspoken scars of a society that valued external image more than bodily ease. And yet, to wear wider, softer, or more practical shoes was to risk derision, for sensible footwear was often associated with the working classes, while the upper classes clung to shapes and styles that emphasized refinement, no matter how painful. To dress the feet properly was to demonstrate one's belonging to the ranks of the respectable, and in the grand hierarchy of Victorian values, comfort was a small price to pay for social approval. Nor were these difficulties confined to daily life alone. Imagine the grand events of the season balls, dinners, theater, outings, where hours upon hours were spent standing, quacking, or dancing in shoes that punished every movement. Women swirled across polished floors in boots that pinched so severely they left lasting marks, while men bowed and led their partners with feet bound tightly in gleaming leather. Each graceful gesture seen by others was purchased at the expense of private pain, endured without complaint, for to show discomfort would be to admit weakness, something society frowned upon as much as a scuffed shoe. In this way, Victorian footwear completed the long chain of burdens that ran from the head to the very ground, each link demanding its own form of submission. The shoes and boots of the age may have appeared elegant, their gleam catching the gaslight of the evening and their shapes completing the silhouette demanded by fashion. But beneath the surface, they carried the hidden cost of aching bones, twisted toes, and weary steps. They were silent reminders that even in something as simple as walking, the Victorians chose spectacle over comfort, and that in this peculiar world, every journey, no matter how short, was a march through elegance lined with pain. If the shoes completed the silhouette from below, the hair crowned it from above. And, in the Victorian world, this too was no simple matter of brushing and tying, but a laborious ritual of design and endurance that consumed as much time and effort as any gown or waistcoat. Hairstyles were not merely personal choices of grooming, they were extensions of fashion itself, dictated by trends, expectations, and social codes that left little room for simplicity. For women, the hair was often described as a woman's greatest ornament, and so it was twisted, braided, piled, and pinned into elaborate arrangements that required both skill and patience to achieve. Rarely could such creations be managed alone, for dozens of pins and combs had to be placed, just so each securing strands in patterns that might involve coils wound tightly against the head, braids interlaced into crowns or hairpieces added to create volume far beyond what nature had provided. To appear in public with hair undone or styled plainly was to risk judgment, for it suggested haste or negligence, qualities no respectable lady wished to display. The sheer variety of these arrangements was astonishing. Each era within the long reign of Queen Victoria had its favorite style. Early decades saw smooth, demure arrangements with central parts and tight coils at the sides, while later years encouraged towering chignons, elaborate braids, or waves that framed the face in soft curls, all of which demanded more time, more tools, and more patience. Hairpieces became an industry of their own, with women purchasing false braids, curls, and pads of human or horsehair to amplify their natural locks, till the line between authentic and artificial blurred into irrelevance. The final effect might be impressive, but it came at the cost of aching scalps, hours lost before mirrors, and the constant presence of pins pressing against the skin. Men were not spared the demands of hair fashion either. Though their styles lacked the towering architecture of women's coiffures, they too were bound by the dictates of the age. The respectable gentleman kept his hair well groomed, often slicked back with generous amounts of pomade, greasy substance that held every strand in place but left pillows stained and collars shining with residue. Beards and mustaches, far from being neglected or natural, were cultivated with equal care, waxed and trimmed into shapes that conveyed dignity and authority. A drooping mustache or unruly whiskers risked undermining a man's appearance just as much as an ill-tied cravat. And so, grooming became a daily task of precision, requiring combs, brushes, oils, and steady hands. What is remarkable is how much symbolism hair carried in this world. For women, long, thick hair was praised as a sign of beauty and vitality, and elaborate styling proved that one had the leisure and resources to maintain it. For men, controlled and polished hair projected discipline and refinement, qualities essential to being taken seriously in business or society. Yet beneath these ideals lay the reality that both genders endured discomfort and inconvenience, sacrificing time and ease for appearances that satisfied social codes rather than personal comfort. Thus, the hair of the Victorian age was not simply grown and groomed, but engineered into conformity, sculpted as carefully as the bodices, bustles, or collars that framed it. Each pin pressed into place, each braid wound tightly, each drop of pomade smoothed across the scalp was another act in the performance of respectability. A performance in which one's very head became a stage for fashion's demands. What made these elaborate hairstyles even more extraordinary was not merely their scale or artistry, but the hidden arsenal of sharp objects required to hold them in place. For every coil of hair, every braid looped across the crown, and every added hairpiece depended on the discreet labor of pins, dozens upon dozens of them, thrust into the arrangement until the head itself resembled a fortress studded with tiny steel supports. Hairpins, though slender and often unremarkable in appearance, became indispensable. Without them, the elaborate structures of Victorian hair would collapse within minutes, undone by the slightest breeze or careless gesture. Women carried so many of these small weapons in their coiffures that to lean one's head against a chair could result in discomfort. To embrace a loved one risked pricking their cheek. To rest one's head against a pillow might mean leaving a few pins behind. The effect was that beauty itself became bound up with danger, every elegant curl secured by a hidden thread of pain. Hatpins only magnified this risk. Though ostensibly designed to secure bonnets or wide-brimmed hats atop the mountainous hairstyles of the age, they often stretched to length so dramatic that they protruded several inches beyond the hair itself, gleaming faintly in the light and reminding all around that proximity was not without peril. A sudden turn of the head, an uncalculated lean in a carriage, or the bustle of a crowded street could bring an unsuspecting neighbor into contact with the sharp tip of one of these pins, and stories circulated of scratched faces, torn fabrics, or worse. Satirical newspapers delighted in portraying the Victorian lady as a walking hazard, her beauty bristling with hidden blades, a figure both admired and feared in equal measure. Yet, despite the dangers, or perhaps because of them, the pins became symbols of an odd kind of empowerment. For women encased in layers of fabric that restricted their movement, for women bound by corsets and the dictates of propriety, the presence of these pins offered a subtle reassurance, a small reminder that beneath the surface of elegance there remained something sharp, something capable of defending itself if necessary. Indeed, accounts exist of women wielding their hatpins in moments of desperation, pricking the hands of unwanted suitors, or striking back against aggressors in crowded spaces. And whether these stories were fact or embellishment, they added to the mystique of the accessory. Still, the everyday risks could not be denied. Mothers warned daughters to take care not to jab themselves while arranging their hair. Friends laughed at the awkwardness of dodging one another's headgear in crowded drawing rooms, and even men acknowledged, half in jest and half in seriousness, that leaning too close to a woman's hat was a dangerous undertaking. In this way, hairpins and hatpins, so ordinary in function, became extraordinary in their consequences, turning the simple act of styling hair into an exercise in caution and calculation. Thus, every elegant hairstyle of the period concealed within its glossy surface a hidden truth. Beauty was dangerous, and the very tools that secured refinement also carried risk. Women who appeared serene and composed at dinner parties or on promenades were in fact bearing not only the weight of elaborate coiffures, but also the quiet responsibility of managing an arsenal of tiny blades. It is a reminder that in the Victorian age, even the pursuit of elegance carried with it an edge, and that behind every curl and feathered hat brim lurked the faint gleam of steel, invisible until the moment it made itself felt. Beyond the layers of fabric, the stiffened collars, and the dangerous forest of pins, Victorian fashion extended its influence directly onto the skin itself, for no face was considered truly complete until it had been carefully treated with the cosmetics of the age. Yet these were not the safe powders and creams of modern vanity tables. For in the 19th century, beauty was often purchased at the price of health. And the ingredients women willingly applied to their skin and eyes read more like the inventory of an apothecary than a dressing table. To achieve the prized pale complexion, powders containing lead or arsenic were dusted across cheeks and foreheads, their chalky whiteness disguising blemishes, while at the same time quietly seeping into the body, causing illnesses that physicians struggled to treat. A face free from freckles or sun-darkened tones was considered the mark of refinement, proof that one did not labor outdoors. And so, even as the powders damaged the skin beneath, women layered them on, convinced that appearance outweighed the risks hidden in each application. The eyes, too, were subject to fashion's peculiar demands, and here belladonna, a substance as beautiful as it was dangerous, found its place. Drops made from the deadly nightshade plant were applied to dilate the pupils, creating the wide, luminous gaze so admired in portraits and novels. Yet the temporary brilliance of the eye came with a price: blurred vision, dizziness, and, with the repeated use, the risk of lasting damage. Still, the allure of appearing striking, even at the cost of one's sight, proved irresistible for many. And so belladonna became yet another instrument in the strange arsenal of Victorian beauty. Rouge, too, was employed, despite being frowned upon in some circles as artificial or scandalous. And mercury-based creams promised smooth skin while slowly poisoning those who trusted them. Each jar and bottle held the possibility of elegance, but also carried the whisper of decay, and in this duality lay the paradox of cosmetic fashion. The irony was that cosmetics were often used discreetly, for too obvious an application could provoke criticism. Society expected women to look flawless, but to pretend that such beauty was natural, creating a peculiar dance in which toxic powders were applied in secret, hidden beneath the guise of modesty, yet judged mercilessly if detected. Men were not immune to this hypocrisy either, for though they publicly denounced paint and powder as deceptive, they admired the results, praising pale skin and bright eyes, while ignoring the quiet suffering required to achieve them. Cosmetics became a kind of unspoken agreement, a dangerous lie accepted by all. The risks were known but ignored in the name of fashion. What makes this all the more haunting is that many women clung to these practices even as their health faltered. Symptoms of poisoning, fatigue, headaches, trembling hands, irritated skin were dismissed as minor inconveniences, small sacrifices on the altar of beauty. To step into a drawing room with a flawless complexion was worth the hidden pain, for in a society that valued appearances above comfort, illness could be endured so long as it remained invisible. Thus, the cosmetic jars of the Victorian dressing table stood as quiet symbols of the age, elegant, kent, polished, promising beauty, yet filled with substances that eroded the body from within. Every application was both a triumph and a gamble, a stroke of powder that masked imperfections while sowing the seeds of harm. In this way, Victorian cosmetics epitomized the strange bargain of the eerie and obsession with refinement so powerful that even poison could be embraced in its pursuit. If powders and creams risked poisoning the skin, then perfume became the invisible veil draped over Victorian life, a final layer of fashion that hovered in the air long after its wearer had left the room. In an age when plumbing was inconsistent and the practice of daily bathing was considered unusual, if not unnecessary, the human body carried with it a presence that society preferred not to acknowledge. Into this gap stepped fragrance, not simply as a luxury, but as a necessity. For without it, the carefully constructed elegance of gowns, bodices, and polished boots would falter beneath the inescapable truth of poor hygiene. To be truly respectable, one had to smell respectable. And so perfumes were applied generously, their notes as much a part of the social uniform as corsets or gloves. The scents themselves were strikingly different from the fresh and floral fragrances familiar today. Many perfumes of the era drew their potency from animal-derived ingredients that lent them a heavy, lingering quality. Musk from deer, ambergris from whales, and civet from wildcats were highly prized. Their deep, almost overwhelming aromas blended with floral oils or spices to create mixtures that could cling to clothing for days. A lady entering a ballroom might leave a trace of perfume on the air that lingered long after her skirts had swept past, while a gentleman's coat could carry its fragrance through an entire evening. These strong notes were not chosen out of mere preference, but because they were capable of masking the odors of unwashed hair, rarely laundered fabrics, and bodies that were scrubbed far less frequently than modern sensibilities might imagine. Yet, perfume was not simply a disguise. It was also a form of expression, a way of projecting identity and mood without words. Certain fragrances became associated with femininity and virtue, others with masculinity and authority, and still others with flirtation and daring. A carefully chosen scent could elevate one's presence in a drawing room as effectively as an elaborate hairstyle or a perfectly fitted bodice. The smell of roses or violets was to suggest innocence and refinement, while richer blends of musk or amber spoke of sophistication and worldly confidence. Perfume was invisible but powerful, an unseen accessory that spoke volumes to those who knew how to interpret its language. At the same time, there was an undeniable tension in its use. Some moralists cautioned against heavy fragrances, warning that they suggested vanity or even moral looseness, while others braced them as essential shields against the less pleasant realities of urban life, where the air itself was often thick with coal, smoke, horse manure, and sewage. For the middle and upper classes, the expense of fine perfumes also became a marker of status, for only those with means could afford the rare ingredients imported from distant lands or harvested from exotic animals. A woman's fragrance thus declared not only her elegance, but her wealth, placing her within a hierarchy that extended even into the realm of scent. The strength of these animal-derived concoctions could be overwhelming in close quarters, filling parlors and carriages with a density of aroma that left some coughing or faint. But as with so many elements of Victorian fashion, the discomfort was accepted, even embraced, as the cost of refinement. To endure the weight of perfume was to endure the unspoken contract of the era itself, appearances above all, even if they choked the senses. In this way, Victorian perfume was both shield and signature, an invisible crown that completed the elaborate costume of a society forever caught between beauty and burden. If perfume hovered invisibly as the final flourish of appearance, then etiquette determined the exact circumstances in which every garment, every accessory, and even every ribbon could or could not be worn, for in the Victorian age fashion was not left to whim, but bound tightly by rules that governed the rhythms of daily life. Clothing did not merely serve the body, it served the clock and the calendar, and to be dressed appropriately was to prove one's awareness of society's endless codes. Morning, afternoon, evening, each hour carried its own demands. Each occasion demanded a costume distinct from the last, and woe betide the man or woman who appeared in the wrong attire at the wrong time. The rules were so intricate that they filled entire manuals, handed down not only through word of mouth but through printed guides, ensuring that anyone with aspirations of respectability knew precisely how to clothe themselves for every possible circumstance. Morning dress, for example, was to be practical yet still polished, designed for errands, household management, or quiet visits within one's circle. A lady might wear a simple gown of cotton or wool, her bonnet modest, her gloves understated, her colors subdued, for morning was not a time for spectacle. The gentleman, meanwhile, could appear in a frock coat and cravat, his attire sober enough to suggest seriousness, but neat enough to display self-discipline. By afternoon, however, the expectations shifted. Social calls, promenades, and visits required more elegance, with fabrics of finer quality, colors chosen to flatter the light of the day, and hats adorned with more elaborate trimmings. A woman might exchange her modest bonnet for something grander. A man might replace his workaday coat with something tailored to impress, and both would adjust their appearance, not for comfort, but for the invisible gaze of society. Evening drew the most stringent demands of all. To attend a dinner, a theater performance, or most of all a ball required clothing of such extravagance that the entire day might be consumed in preparation. Ladies changed into gowns of silk or satin, their bodices tightly fitted, their skirts sweeping, their jewelry chosen carefully to match the occasion without overstepping into gaudy excess. Gentlemen exchanged frock coats for tailcoats, their cravats tied with meticulous care, their shoes polished to gleam beneath candlelight. To arrive improperly dressed was to risk humiliation, not only for oneself, but for one's entire household. For every detail of one's appearance was read as a statement of family respectability and social intelligence. The true tyranny of this system lay in its endless variations. Mourning required an entirely separate wardrobe, governed by rules as rigid as those of ordinary society, with black worn for set periods of time, depending on one's relation to the deceased. Garden parties demanded lighter colors, winter outings, heavier fabrics. Each form of entertainment carried its own set of costumes. Even the smallest misstep, the wrong shade of glove, hat, too elaborate for morning. A bodice deemed plain for evening could spark whispers of impropriety, those quiet judgments that spread quickly in a society obsessed with appearances. In this way, fashion etiquette became less about beauty itself and more about discipline, a constant rehearsal of one's role within society's performance. To dress correctly was to prove that one understood the rules, that one was educated, refined, and aware, and to fail was to risk social exile. Thus, every choice of garment, every adjustment of ribbon or lace, Every decision to wear silk rather than wool was freighted with meaning, transforming the act of dressing into a daily examination of character. It was a system that demanded vigilance at every moment, leaving the Victorian man or woman not simply clothed but constantly scrutinized. Actors forever performing under the relentless spotlight of etiquette. The weight of these rules did not rest lightly on Victorian shoulders, for beneath the silks and starch lay the constant fear of failure, the ever-present anxiety that one might, through ignorance or accident, misstep in the intricate dance of fashion etiquette. To break a dress code was not a small matter of embarrassment, but a potential catastrophe of reputation, a silent scandal that could echo far beyond the moment itself. Appear in a gown too lavish for a morning call, and whispers might circulate that one was desperate for attention. Arrive at an evening ball without the proper gloves, and eyes would linger not on the orchestra or the chandeliers, but on the offending hands, bare and accusatory. Every social gathering became a test, every outing a performance, and mistakes were remembered far longer than successes, for gossip, once stirred, rarely faded quickly in a society hungry for judgment. What made the situation particularly treacherous was that the rules, though written down in etiquette books, lived most vividly in the minds of those who enforced them through gossip and glances. A newcomer to society, perhaps freshly arrived from the countryside or from abroad, could find themselves bewildered by the invisible codes that everyone else seemed to know instinctively. A hat too ornate at a luncheon, a dress too plain for the theater, a coat worn at the wrong hour of the day. Such errors might seem trivial to modern eyes. Yet, in the parlors and drawing rooms of the 19th century, they could mark one as vulgar, dated, or simply unfit for polite company. Once that judgment settled, it could be nearly impossible to dislodge, for fashion was not only about appearance, but about belonging, and to fail at one was to risk exclusion from the other. Even within families, the burden of these rules was felt sharply. A daughter, improperly dressed at her debut, could tarnish not only her own reputation, but that of her parents, casting a shadow over prospects of marriage or friendship. A gentleman whose coat was outdated or poorly fitted might find his business ventures subtly undermined. For in a society where image was everything, even competence was measured by how one looked. And because fashion changed with dizzying speed, skirts widening, bustles shrinking, collars rising or falling, the possibility of error was ever present, requiring constant vigilance and expense to remain current. To be seen as out of fashion was not simply to lack taste. It was to risk being marked as careless, as falling behind, as someone who did not belong among the refined. The cruel irony was that while fashion was meant to elevate, it often served as a trap, ensnaring men and women in endless cycles of anxiety. Instead of providing joy, it created a minefield where every gathering became an opportunity to fail. Those who succeeded did so by walking a fine line, never appearing too eager yet, never falling behind, dressing with precision while pretending it required no effort at all. To master fashion etiquette was to conceal the struggle it demanded, and to stumble was to reveal the truth that beneath the silks and satins, beneath the polished boots and perfumed hair, lay human beings burdened by rules too heavy for comfort. Thus, breaking a dress code in Victorian society was never simply about the clothes themselves. It was about identity, belonging, and survival in a world where appearance was inseparable from worth. The cost of a mistake could be measured not in fabric, but in reputation. And in the delicate theater of fashion, reputation was everything. As if the labyrinth of etiquette within drawing rooms and ballrooms were not taxing enough, the dangers multiplied once one stepped outside. For the very act of walking in public in Victorian cities became an ordeal of balance, vigilance, and endurance. Streets were not the orderly, paved walkways we take for granted today, but uneven paths of cobblestone or dirt, slick with rain, churned by horses, and crowded with carts and people. To venture into them, dressed in layers of delicate fabrics and towering skirts, was to court disaster at every step. Mud pooled in ruts, manure lay thick where carriages had passed, and puddles reflected not the sky but the grime of a city still wrestling with sanitation. For a lady with skirts that trailed the ground, each stride risked disaster. Lines soiled beyond saving, shoes swallowed by muck, and the faint but constant possibility of slipping into humiliation before an audience of strangers. Nor were the hazards confined to the earth beneath one's feet. Carriages thundered past with little regard for pedestrians, their wheels spraying mud and their drivers cracking whips as they navigated the chaotic roads. To cross the street required courage and calculation, for one had to gather armfuls of skirts, step carefully between horses, and hope that no sudden start sent a carriage surging forward at the wrong moment. Even gentlemen in their polished boots and canes were not immune to danger. Though their attire was spared, the sweeping skirts that so often acted as traps for mud and wheels. Street crossings became spectacles in themselves, watched with a mix of curiosity and amusement by passers-by, and even the most elegant lady could find herself reduced to comic struggle as she tried to preserve her dignity in the face of filth and chaos. Then there were the ever-present urchins, children of the streets who darted through the crowds with quick hands and mischievous grins. Some offered assistance for a fee lifting skirts above puddles or clearing paths through the press of bodies, but others sought mischief or opportunity, tugging at hems, snatching dropped handkerchiefs, or even attempting to relieve pockets of their contents while their victims struggled to keep balance on the treacherous ground. For the fashionable classes, every outing into public streets was thus a negotiation, not only with dirt and weather, but with human unpredictability, adding yet another layer of strain to the already heavy burden of fashion. The irony was that promenading, the very act of being seen walking in public, was an essential part of social life. Parks, boulevards, and busy squares were stages upon which reputation was built, where dresses and hats could be displayed, where glances exchanged and alliances quietly formed. Yet the stage itself was treacherous, its boards slick with mud and crowded with obstacles. To appear graceful under such conditions required immense practice, patience, and a constant awareness that a single misstep might undo hours of preparation. Every outing was a gamble, a wager placed against the forces of weather, dirt, and disorder. And victory came not in the form of reaching a destination, but in doing so without stain, stumble, or shame. In this way, walking in public in the Victorian world became an extension of the same paradox that defined its fashion. Beauty at war with practicality, elegance. Continually tested by discomfort and dignity, forced to navigate the indignities of a world far less polished than the garments worn to face it. Each step forward was not simply movement through the city, but a performance, a determination to carry refinement across ground that resisted it at every turn. If the perils of walking through mud and crowded streets tested the endurance of the body, the rituals of calling cards tested the endurance of patience and propriety, for here to the Victorians transformed what might have been simple acts of friendship into elaborate performances of etiquette. In a society where every gesture carried meaning, one could not simply drop by a neighbor's home unannounced or casually knock upon a door, for visits were governed by an intricate system of ritualized calling that demanded both preparation and precision. At the center of this practice lay the calling card, a small rectangle of stiff paper, often engraved with elegant script, which served not merely as a token of identity, but as a passport into the delicate world of social interaction. To present one's card was to declare one's presence, one's intentions, and one's awareness of the rules that separated the refined from the careless. The process itself was a spectacle of formality. A lady or gentleman arriving at a house would not expect to be admitted immediately into company. Instead, the card was delivered to the servant at the door, who would carry it to the mistress of the house, leaving her to decide whether to acknowledge the visit or decline it. Sometimes the caller waited, sometimes they departed, and sometimes the card itself was the visit, left behind as a polite gesture without expectation of conversation. Each variation carried its own meaning. To fold down a corner of the card suggested that the visit was made in person, while leaving it flat implied only symbolic presence. Cards marked with initials might indicate congratulations, condolences, or farewells, sparing the need for words while binding the participants into the silent conversation of etiquette. What made this ritual so peculiar was the distance it enforced. Relationships that might otherwise have grown naturally were mediated through these scraps of card, as though true intimacy was too dangerous to allow. A drawer filled with neatly stacked cards became not merely a record of visitors, but a map of one's social standing, proof that others had acknowledged your presence, your household, and your place within the hierarchy of respectability. To be without such cards was to risk invisibility, and invisibility was as damaging as scandal. The pressure to maintain this system meant that households invested in engraved stationery, servants trained in the proper handling of cards, to endless hours spent arranging and responding to visits according to the dictates of fashion. For those who hoped to rise in society, calling cards were lifelines, and their careful use could open doors to circles otherwise closed. A well-timed visit, signaled by the delicate delivery of a card, might lead to an invitation, which in turn might lead to opportunities of friendship, marriage, or advancement. But the minefield was treacherous for it to fail in the ritual. By calling at the wrong hour, by neglecting to leave a card, or by overstaying one's welcome could produce the opposite effect of branding one as ignorant of the codes that governed polite life. Thus, even in the realm of supposed leisure, the Victorian was never free. For every gesture was scrutinized, every omission noted, and every card both a bridge and a barrier. The irony, of course, was that such formality often discouraged genuine closeness. Visits became brief, carefully timed, conversations polite but distant, all designed to maintain appearances rather than to foster intimacy. In this way, the calling card served as a perfect symbol of Victorian fashion itself. Outwardly elegant, meticulously controlled, and endlessly concerned with propriety, yet inwardly stifling, leaving individuals cased not only in fabric, but in the weight of rules too rigid to allow ease. Each card handed over was another stitch in the great costume of society, a reminder that in this peculiar world, even friendship was measured, codified, and bound by etiquette. If calling cards dictated who might cross the threshold of a house, dinner parties revealed the true cause of Victorian fashion, for these gatherings, meant to display elegance and hospitality, often became grueling ordeals that tested the limits of the body under layers of silk, steel, and expectation. To the outsider, a dining room glittering with candles and silver, filled with guests in their finest attire, might seem the height of refinement, but for those seated at the long tables, the evening could feel less like a celebration and more like a trial of endurance. Corsets drawn tight hours before the first course allowed little room for the lungs to expand, and every breath came shallow and deliberate, forcing women to mask discomfort with practiced smiles. Bustles and voluminous skirts crowded chairs, leaving little space to sit comfortably, and each shift of posture risked displacing a carefully arranged gown or pressing the rigid framework of fashion painfully into the spine. Eating itself, the very heart of the occasion, became a challenge. The constriction of corsets pressed mercilessly on the stomach, leaving little room for the elaborate succession of courses that Victorian hosts prided themselves on serving. Guests nibbled delicately at dishes, not because of appetite, but because of necessity. For to attempt a hearty meal was to risk discomfort so intense it might break the facade of composure. Gentlemen, though spared the corset, cased their own limitations. Stiff collars and tightly tailored waistcoats made bending toward a plate awkward, while the layers of formality demanded that every gesture, every sip of soup, every slice of meat be performed with meticulous grace. The irony was rich. The more elaborate the feast, the less able its guests were to enjoy it fully, imprisoned as they were by the very fashions meant to display their refinement. Conversation, too, was shaped by these restrictions. A lady's voice, softened by the shallow breaths permitted by her corset, carried lightly across the table, requiring effort to maintain liveliness, while men, overheated in their formal jackets, tapped discreetly at their brows, careful never to betray the discomfort of wool and starch under the glow of gaslight. The dinner party thus became a performance on two stages, one visible, where wit, charm, and elegance were displayed for the company, and one invisible, where each guest silently endured the constrictions of fashion while pretending it did not exist. The laughter and chatter that filled the room were often as rehearsed as the clothing. Another layer of disguise in an evening dedicated not to relaxation but to spectacle, and yet attendance was not optional. To refuse an invitation was to risk social slight, to miss the chance to solidify connections. And so, guests submitted willingly to these ordeals, trading ease for opportunity. A successful dinner party could elevate a family's standing, while a poorly managed one might provoke whispers of incompetence or neglect. Thus, the discomfort endured by individuals was overlooked, subsumed into the larger drama of reputation and social maneuvering. The dining table, though laden with delicacies, was as much a battlefield as any promenade or ballroom, where appearances had to be maintained at all costs. In this way, the dinner party perfectly encapsulated the paradox of Victorian society. Moments designed for pleasure that instead became tests of endurance. Gatherings intended to nourish that instead restricted. And evenings meant to bring people together that instead showcased the distance enforced by fashion, to survive the night with one's dignity intact. Smiling through shallow breaths and stiff backs, to pass yet another unspoken examination of refinement, proving once more that in this age, appearances mattered far more than comfort. Beyond the dinner table awaited the grandest arena of Victorian social life, the ballroom, a place where elegance was meant to reach its most dazzling heights, but where reality often descended into a mixture of confusion, exhaustion, and carefully concealed chaos. To step into a hall lit by chandeliers, music swelling from the orchestra floors polished to a gleam, and ranks of women in satin and men in black coats, was to enter a theater in which every guest became both actor and audience. The ball was designed to display grace, wealth, and refinement. Yet the very fashions that created this spectacle turned the event into something perilously close to farce. Skirts stretched so wide that partners struggled to approach one another without colliding, while bustles, hoops, and endless trains transformed each waltz into a careful negotiation of space, rather than a fluid dance of joy. The floor, crowded with bodies encased in restrictive garments, often resembled less a graceful swirl than a sea of collisions. Dancers found themselves tripping over hems, skirts tangled with skirts, and elbows knocked awkwardly as couples fought for space. A lady spinning too quickly might send her crinoline sweeping into her neighbor, upsetting balance and dignity alike, while a gentleman, forced to guide his partner through the crowd, often did so with gritted teeth, his stiff collar cutting against his neck and his boots pinching with every step. The orchestra played on, determined to maintain the illusion of harmony. Yet beneath the surface, the dance was as much a battle for survival as it was a celebration of elegance. Fainting became almost expected in such settings, for corsets pulled tight throughout the evening left many women lightheaded long before midnight. The heat of candles, the press of bodies, and the endless movement only worsened the strain. And so side rooms and stairwells were often crowded with ladies recovering from swoons, while their companions murmured reassurances and adjusted gowns. To faint gracefully was almost a skill in itself, for collapsing without disrupting the flow of the evening required practice, and those who managed it with composure often returned to the dance floor as though nothing had occurred. Servants circulated with fans, salts, and glasses of water, tending to guests while the festivities continued, proof that the spectacle was expected to proceed regardless of the toll it took on the bodies of those involved. Yet, despite the hazards, the ballroom remained irresistible. For it was not merely a place of dancing, but a marketplace of status and opportunity. Every bow, every curtsy, every introduction carried meaning. And the pairing of partners was as much about alliances as about rhythm. A young woman's gown was scrutinized for its quality, her steps for their grace, her family's position silently measured against the cut of a gentleman's coat or the polish of his boots. Beneath the laughter and music, calculations were constant, alliances negotiated with each turn across the floor. The dance was social maneuvering disguised as festivity. And those who navigated it successfully might secure friendships, fortunes, or even marriage, while those who faltered risked whispers that lingered long after the music ceased. In this way, the Victorian ball encapsulated the contradictions of the age: breathtaking beauty that concealed discomfort, grandeur that masked chaos, elegance forever at odds with the realities of fabric, bone, and breath. Guests departed in the early hours with aching feet, bruised ribs, and exhausted smiles, yet they returned again and again. For to abstain was to step outside society's most glittering stage. The ball was both ordeal and opportunity, theater and trial. A spectacle so chaotic that it should have collapsed under its own absurdity, so alluring that it became the very heartbeat of Victorian social life. If the ballroom was a swirl of fabric and ambition, the ideals that drove those grand displays were far less fleeting. For beneath every gown, every corset, every layer of powder and perfume lay the unspoken belief that beauty was measured not by comfort, but by the ability to endure suffering with elegance. Victorian society admired not only how one looked, but how much one was willing to sacrifice to achieve that look, and thus pain itself became woven into the very fabric of fashion. To wear clothing that compressed the ribs, to walk in shoes that carved blisters, to apply cosmetics that poisoned the skin, was not considered cruelty, but refinement, proof that one belonged to the ranks of the respectable, and that one's body could serve as both canvas and cage in the pursuit of an ideal. Women bore the heaviest share of this burden, their bodies reshaped daily to conform to silhouettes that defied nature. The corset pressed so fiercely against lungs and stomach that shallow breathing, dizziness, and even fainting were constant companions. Yet these moments of weakness were paradoxically recast as signs of delicacy, an almost desirable fragility that suggested refinement. The bustle forced them to balance awkwardly. The crinolines extended their skirts into obstacles. The petticoats added weight and heat until movement itself became a struggle. And yet all of this was endured for the sake of a figure that society applauded from a distance. Even the very act of dressing required assistance, robbing women of independence and reinforcing the idea that beauty was not only painful but impractical, demanding submission not only to fashion but to the social structures that enforced it. The cost was not limited to discomfort, but extended deeply into health. Countless reports spoke of spinal deformities, compressed organs, and damaged muscles. Yet these warnings did little to loosen the grip of fashion's demands. Cosmetics, too, carried their own silent injuries, lead and arsenic leaching through the skin, belladonna clouding the eyes, mercury creams staining beauty with invisible harm, perfumes, while masking the scents of daily life, filled lungs with heavy animal-derived musk that lingered long after the pleasure of the evening had faded. Even the simple adornment of gloves, hats, and pins became trials limiting touch, balance, and ease, yet all accepted without complaint. For to complain was to risk revealing weakness, and weakness, however widespread, was to be hidden behind a mask of elegance. What made these ideals all the more powerful was the way they were celebrated in art, literature, and society's constant reinforcement. Paintings depicted women with impossibly small waists. Novels praised heroines for their delicate fragility. and etiquette books spoke endlessly of the importance of appearance, discipline, and grace. To suffer was not merely expected, but glorified, as though the endurance of discomfort were itself a badge of honor, a testament to character as well as beauty. Those who bore it without flinching were admired. Those who faltered were pitied or criticized, and thus the cycle continued, binding generations to an aesthetic that confused pain with perfection. In the end, Victorian beauty ideals revealed themselves not as natural standards, but as carefully constructed performances, demanding that women surrender comfort, health, and freedom in order to embody society's vision of refinement. It was a vision that consumed both body and spirit, replacing ease with elegance, liberty with lace, and well-being with whispers of admiration that faded as quickly as the candlelight at the close of a ball. To be beautiful was to suffer, and to suffer beautifully was, in the Victorian world, the highest achievement of all. While women endured the agonies of corsets, bustles, and poisonous cosmetics, men, too, were bound to their own elaborate rituals of appearance, for Victorian society demanded that masculinity be polished into an image of dignity and control, sculpted not only by clothing, but by the very face presented to the world. Shaving was no casual matter of convenience, but a daily trial performed with straight razors that required skill and patience, for a careless slip of the hand could leave more than a stinging cut could mar the very image of refinement that society expected. To appear unshaven was to risk looking slovenly, and thus men rose early, sharpened their blades, and carved their faces into smoothness as carefully as an artist, chiseling marble, each stroke an affirmation of discipline, each splash of cold water a reminder that pain and effort were inseparable from respectability. But the bare face was only one part of the performance, for the Victorian obsession with grooming extended into the management of hair with an almost military precision. Pomade, thick and heavy with oil or wax, was applied daily to tame and shape hair into styles that would not falter, even under hours of social exposure. The scent of these concoctions lingered, mixing with perfume and tobacco smoke, creating an aura that clung to collars and coats long after the man had departed a room. Hair was parted with exactitude, smoothed into place, and maintained throughout the day with combs discreetly carried for moments of correction. Grease-stained collars and hats, yet the gleam it gave was considered indispensable, for without it, hair was unruly, and unruliness was a threat to the fragile mask of refinement. Facial hair itself carried its own intricate set of rules, changing with fashions tied and loaded with meanings that extended beyond mere appearance. At times, a full beard suggested wisdom and strength. At others, it was the mustache alone that marked modernity and style. And still, in other seasons, a clean-shaven chin was hailed as the pinnacle of civility. Manuals advised men on which form suited which age, class, or occasion, and to wear the wrong style at the wrong time risked subtle ridicule. The whiskers of a gentleman were not personal but public, judged as carefully as the fit of his coat or the polish of his boots, and thus grooming became not a choice but a duty. Even the simplest acts of the morning routine carried weight far beyond the mirror. A well-kept man was read as disciplined, reliable, trustworthy. A man who neglected his appearance invited suspicion about his competence, his morals, even his social standing. To step into the world with a beard untrimmed or hair unpomaded was to risk whispers as surely as a woman appearing at a ball without gloves. And so men, no less than women, bore the burden of ritualized suffering, enduring cuts, greased hair, and the constant labor of maintenance in order to present an image of composure that was never truly effortless. In this way, men's grooming reflected the same paradox that defined Victorian fashion at large: a relentless pursuit of refinement that demanded daily discomfort, turning every razor, every dab of pomade, every disciplined trimming of whiskers into another link in the chain of appearances. Beneath the polished surface laid the same truth. Beauty and respectability in this age could not exist without sacrifice. And even the seemingly simple face of a gentleman was in fact a mask, carefully carved and endlessly maintained. Beyond razors, pomade, corsets, and gloves, the true language of Victorian fashion was spoken not with words, but with fabrics, scents, and silhouettes, for in this society, every detail of appearance functioned as a code, silently broadcasting messages that could be read by those who knew the rules. To step into a drawing room was to enter a world where nothing was accidental. The cut of a coat, the richness of a fabric, the choice of a color, even the faint trace of perfume trailing in the air, all conveyed unspoken truths about the wearer. Clothing and fragrance alike became a form of social currency, a way of declaring wealth, class, propriety, or availability without ever moving the lips. And this subtle yet powerful language shaped every interaction in Victorian life. Wealth, for instance, was made visible not only through jewelry or grand houses, but through the very weight of fabric in one's garments. For fine silks and layers of costly materials were a privilege of the affluent. A woman whose skirts swept richly across the floor, supported by the newest crinoline, was not simply dressed, but announcing that her family possessed the means to indulge in discomfort for the sake of spectacle. Perfume, too, distinguished the wealthy from the ordinary. Animal-derived scents such as musk, civet, and ambergris were expensive luxuries, their lingering potency marking those who could afford refinement, while lighter floral waters, though pleasant, betrayed lesser means. In this way, society could measure a person's resources by a single whiff as easily as by a single glance. Class and propriety were equally inscribed into fashion. Morning attire, for example, was one of the most rigidly codified aspects of Victorian dress. And to appear in black was to declare loss without uttering a word. Not only did the depth of one's morning attire indicate closeness to the deceased, but the gradual return to color over months or years spoke of one's progression through grief. To neglect these customs was not merely careless, but disrespectful, a signal to society that one did not belong among the refined. Similarly, young women were expected to wear lighter colors and simpler dresses to signal innocence, while married women wore richer hues and heavier adornments to reflect their status. Even the tilt of a bonnet, the choice of glove, or the adornment of a hat might carry meaning about one's availability for courtship. And the watchful eyes of society rarely missed such signs. For men, too, clothing and grooming acted as declarations of identity. The severity of a black coat at a business meeting, the elegance of a white tie at an evening ball, or the careful selection of a walking stick, all revealed not only taste but ambition, marking the difference between a gentleman of leisure and one who aspired to climb higher. Just as women's attire could hint at their family's fortune or their readiness for marriage, so men's choices of scent, fabric, and grooming revealed their place in the social hierarchy. The body itself became a canvas upon which messages of class, wealth, and desire were painted in strokes invisible to the untrained, but obvious to those immersed in the code. Thus, perfume and clothing functioned as a secret language, one that governed society as surely as any law or custom. To those who mastered its vocabulary, it offered power, the ability to signal belonging, to attract admiration, to assert dominance without a word spoken. To those who failed, it risked exclusion, misunderstanding, or even scandal. Every gown and glove, every spritz of scent, every ribbon chosen was more than an accessory. It was a sentence in the silent conversation of Victorian life, a reminder that in this world, appearances were never only appearances, but declarations of identity, spoken in silk, lace, and fragrance, while perfume and fabric spoke in whispers of identity and intent. The very impracticality of Victorian dress shouted aloud the greatest truth of all, that clothing was not only about beauty, but about class. and that every pleat, pin, polished button served as evidence of whether one belonged to the world of labor or the world of leisure. In a society where the chasm between the working poor and the affluent elite yawned wide, fashion itself became a visible signpost, a kind of uniform that revealed not only what one wore, but what one was privileged never to do. For the wealthy, the most desirable garments were not those that allowed ease of movement, but those that made movement nearly impossible. For to struggle with crinolines too wide to pass through a doorway, or to stagger under the weight of skirts so heavy they dragged along the floor, was to announce unmistakably, this body would never soil itself with toil. Every sweeping gown, every stiffened collar, every pair of gloves that limited the use of the hands was part of this declaration. Women of means, encased in corsets that robbed them of breath, could not possibly bend to scrub floors, carry water, or tend fields. Men whose boots gleamed and whose coats fitted snugly at the shoulders were unlikely to wield tools or break a sweat at manual trades. Even accessories underscored the same divide: canes carried by gentlemen more for style than necessity, fans fluttered by ladies not to cool themselves but to punctuate conversation with gestures of refinement. In contrast, those who labored wore clothes of sturdier fabrics, looser cuts, and darker colors, garments meant for durability and function rather than spectacle. The distinction was immediate and unavoidable. To see someone in delicate silk or snowy linen was to know they belonged to a world where survival did not depend on work of the body. This symbolism extended beyond simple practicality into the very theater of social life. To appear in finery while promenading through a park was not only to showcase wealth, but to assert separation from the masses who tramped through mud in coarse boots and patched trousers. A lady's skirts, vast and unmanageable, acted almost like barriers, keeping the world at a distance, while a gentleman's top hat elevated him quite literally above the crowd. Clothing thus became architecture, constructing not only an image, but a space in which one's class was visibly protected. It was not enough to say one was wealthy. One had to prove it in garments that would disintegrate in a factory or a kitchen, garments that existed only because others, unseen and unacknowledged, labored to support them. The paradox, of course, was that this fashion, so prized by the elite, was admired even by those who could not afford it, reinforcing the very hierarchies it symbolized. Working women stitched gowns they themselves would never wear. Laundresses scoured linen they could never own, and tailors pressed jackets that only others would parade. Thus, the clothing of the upper classes did more than reflect privilege. It depended upon the hidden labor of those beneath them. Every seam and stitch carrying the weight of another's toil. Fashion was therefore both a mirror and a wall. A mirror reflecting society's divisions, and a wall ensuring they remained firmly in place. In this way, Victorian fashion did not simply reveal beauty or conceal flaws. It displayed power, separating those who could afford the luxury of impracticality from those whose very survival required practicality at all times. To wear clothing that could not withstand work was to declare to the world that one did not need to work. And, in a society obsessed with appearances, no signal could be louder or more enduring. If the wardrobes of the wealthy glittered with silks, lace, and perfumes, the clothing of children in the lower classes told an entirely different story. One written not in the language of luxury, but in the harsher dialect of necessity, while society's elite swirled through ballrooms in impractical finery. The vast majority of Victorians lived in garments chosen for survival rather than spectacle, garments that revealed not wealth or leisure, but endurance. Clothing was not a costume of display, but a tool of labor, often plain, often worn thin, and just as often passed down from sibling to sibling, patched and repatched until fabric could no longer hold together. The difference was not merely one of style, but of life itself. For, while upper-class fashion declared freedom from work, the clothing of the poor bore daily witness to toil, weather, and want. Children in working families, in particular, wore smaller versions of practicality, not miniature gowns or suits designed for elegance, but garments shaped by necessity. Dresses for little girls were cut from rough cloth, often dyed dark to conceal dirt, while boys wore trousers patched at the knees and shirts faded from repeated washing in cold water. Shoes were precious, sometimes worn until soles nearly disappeared, sometimes shared among siblings, and often absent altogether. It was common to see children running barefoot through alleys or trudging to work in factories with nothing to protect their feet from the stones and filth of the streets. To be barefoot was not a fashion statement, but a condition of poverty, a visible marker of class as clear as the silks that swept across ballroom floors. Among the lower classes, adults too lived in clothing that emphasized durability above all. Wool and coarse cotton dominated, garments made to withstand the friction of labor rather than to flatter the figure. An apron might serve not as a dainty accessory, but as protection from soot and grease. A cap might shield from weather rather than announce social standing. The lines of fashion that dictated morning, afternoon, and evening attire for the wealthy dissolved entirely here. For the working poor often possessed only a handful of garments in total, worn until they were threadbare, repaired, and worn again. To dress was not to prepare for society, but simply to arm oneself against the demands of another day's work. And yet, even within these constraints, people found ways to adapt, to stitch dignity into what little they had. So a ribbon saved from better times might be tied into a child's hair. A carefully scrubbed collar might brighten a laborer's shirt. And even the poorest often sought to present themselves with as much neatness as circumstances allowed. But the gulf between classes was unmistakable, for where the wealthy struggled under the burden of too much fabric, the poor struggled under the burden of too little, their clothing reflecting not the luxury of discomfort, but the harshness of survival. In this contrast lay the truest reflection of Victorian fashion's paradox. For the elite, clothing was a declaration of status, impractical and suffocating, worn as proof of freedom from work. For the lower classes and their children, clothing was stripped to its raw function, to cover, to endure, to last. Where one displayed excess, the other bore scarcity, and in that gulf, one could read the inequalities of an entire age. Though children of the poor trudged barefoot, and the wealthy stumbled under gowns too wide for doorways, the thread that bound all classes together was the same relentless truth. Victorian society valued appearances above all else, elevating fashion beyond mere fabric and stitching into a theater of status, control, and conformity. To dress was never simply to clothe oneself against the elements. It was to step onto a stage where every detail was scrutinized, where each button, ribbon, and cent carried meaning, and where failure to perform according to expectation could leave one not merely embarrassed, but excluded from the very fabric of society. Clothing was at once armor and costume, a public declaration of belonging, and in this world where judgment hovered at every corner, no one could afford to appear careless, no matter the cost to body or spirit. For the wealthy, appearances functioned as a visible manifestation of power. Skirts that swept mud and required servants to lift them did more than decorate. They declared that the wearer need never soil her hands with labor. Men's tightly tailored suits, collars stiff enough to choke, and gleaming shoes proclaimed mastery over time and body alike, suggesting a life untouched by manual work. To wear garments that constrained breathing, limited movement, or demanded assistance to fasten was to display one's immunity from practicality, to show that others existed to shoulder the burdens of labor, while one floated through salons and parlors as if discomfort were itself a badge of refinement. Fashion here was not indulgence alone, but discipline, a system of control that required constant vigilance and unyielding sacrifice. Yet, beneath the glitter of ballrooms and the polished silver of dinner parties, this performance imposed itself on everyone. For women, The pressure to embody fragile beauty meant hours of preparation, bodies reshaped and starved of comfort to fit an ideal that praised delicacy over vitality. For men, the daily rituals of shaving, pomading, and collaring reinforced a standard of restraint. Grooming transformed into a mirror of discipline. Even children, dressed as miniature adults, bore the weight of their family's aspirations, their clothing signaling not who they were, but who society expected them to become. The poorest could not escape the judgment either. Their patched garments and bare feet, though dictated by necessity, marked them immediately as outsiders to the rituals of refinement. Fashion, therefore, became not a personal choice, but a collective demand, its rules as inescapable as gravity. The true cruelty of this system lay in its insistence on conformity. Individuality was stifled beneath etiquette manuals and the constant whisper of gossip. And even rebellion against fashion could only exist within the same framework, noticed and judged precisely because it strayed from expectation. To wear too little was careless, to wear too much was vulgar, and to wear incorrectly was to risk social ruin. Each morning began not with the question of what one wished to wear, but with the calculation of what one must wear to remain invisible in one's perfection. Society applauded the illusion of effortlessness while demanding endless labor to maintain it, a paradox that left its participants trapped in cycles of suffering disguised as elegance. In the end, Victorian fashion was less about beauty than about control over the body, over social mobility, over the boundaries of class and gender. Clothing became a language of obedience, each garment a pledge of conformity, its accessory a token of submission to the relentless gaze of society. To survive was to perform, to dress not for oneself but for others, and in that performance the true essence of Victorian life revealed itself. A world where appearances eclipsed practicality and where the price of belonging was paid in discomfort, restraint, and the quiet erasure of self beneath the weight of silk lace and expectation. If fashion was the stage upon which Victorians performed their status and refinement, then failure in that performance was a danger as real as any illness, for mistakes in dress were not overlooked but magnified, dissected, and whispered about until it took on a life of their own. Clothing was not only a declaration of belonging, but also a constant test and to stumble in the ritual. Whether by wearing the wrong attire at the wrong hour, by appearing in fabrics too plain for the company one kept, or by displaying an accessory out of season, was to invite a cascade of gossip that could echo through parlors, drawing rooms, and streets. In a society where appearances were equated with morality and competence, fashion failures became more than small lapses. They were interpreted as character flaws, evidence of ignorance, vanity, or even deceit, and such interpretations spread with merciless speed. The surveillance was constant and unrelenting. For every gathering, every promenade, every visit became a silent inspection. Guests at a dinner table observed not only the food, but the fit of gloves, the stitching of bodices, the sheen of shoes. Dancers at a ball were judged as much by the crispness of their attire as by the grace of their steps. Even in moments meant for leisure, such as walks through the park, society's eyes followed, measuring hats against the hour of day, coats against the weather, gowns against the dignity of their wearers. To be seen was to be scrutinized, and to be scrutinized was to risk censure. For the line between elegance and error was as thin as the edge of a razor. What made this system especially cruel was that the rules were both precise and shifting. Etiquette manuals dictated strict expectations, yet fashion itself changed so rapidly that what was correct in one season might be laughable in the next. A woman who invested in a gown one year could find it mocked the next, not because her taste had failed, but because the current had turned against her. A gentleman too slow to adopt a new collar style might be judged as old-fashioned, while one too eager to embrace novelty risked being accused of frivolity. There was no safety in stasis, only in relentless adaptation, and even adaptation required perfect timing, for misjudging the moment could be as costly as refusing change altogether. Thus, fashion became a form of surveillance not administered by the state, but by neighbors, acquaintances, and so-called friends. Every eye was a judge, every whisper a verdict, and reputations could crumble under the weight of collective scrutiny. Those who failed were not punished by law, but by exclusion. Invitations quietly withheld. Smiles replaced with cold glances. Business opportunities lost in the subtle silence of disapproval. To be poorly dressed was to be poor in social capital, and in an age when connections were currency, the loss was devastating. In this way, the world of Victorian fashion resembled an invisible prison, its bars made of lace and linen, its guards the endless gaze of peers. Freedom of expression was sacrificed to the necessity of conformity, and individuality was crushed beneath the fear of humiliation. To walk into a room was to submit oneself to judgment, and to dress each morning was to prepare for inspection, not by choice, but by compulsion. Fashion, meant to beautify, became instead an instrument of control, a system of constant surveillance, where a single mistake could shadow a life far longer than the garments in which it was made. If every misstep in attire risked whispers and exclusion, then the larger truth becomes inescapable. Victorian fashion itself was both a dazzling spectacle and an unrelenting prison, a glittering facade that enthralled the eye while quietly draining the body and spirit of those who bore its weight. It was a theater of elegance where silks, satins, brocades, and jewels shimmered under candlelight, where corseted figures moved with apparent grace, and where men and women alike played their roles with carefully rehearsed precision. Yet behind the curtain of beauty lay suffering so normalized that it became invisible. The spectacle delighted society, but the prison ensured obedience. And together they defined an era in which appearances reigned supreme, no matter the cost. Victoria, the grandeur was undeniable. Balls, promenades, and dinner parties offered visions of refinement that inspired awe. Their participants arrayed like living statues, the ladies framed by towering skirts and sparkling tiaras, the gentlemen polished in black coats and gleaming shoes. Every detail proclaimed wealth, stability, and status, transforming social gatherings into moving exhibitions of fashion's artistry. To behold such scenes was to be reminded of the immense human capacity for invention and beauty, and in that sense, Victorian fashion dazzled as a spectacle of cultural pride. Yet for those within the costumes, the story was far less radiant. Beauty demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was enforced through whalebone, steel, powders laced with poison, and rules so rigid that even breathing or walking could become a test of endurance. Health was the first victim of this paradox. Women fainted beneath the crushing grip of corsets, organs displaced by the unyielding demand for tiny waists. Men suffered too, confined by collars that constricted throats and stiff fabrics that punished the simplest of movements. Cosmetics promised radiance, but delivered toxins. Perfumes cloaked the body in scent, but filled lungs with heavy fumes. Even footwear reshaped feet into painful deformities, proving that no part of the body was spared in the relentless pursuit of fashion's ideal. Comfort was not only sacrificed, but dismissed as irrelevant, for discomfort itself became a badge of respectability, proof that one had chosen refinement over ease. Individuality, too, was swallowed by conformity. The rules of fashion left no room for personal whim, binding every man, woman, and child into a collective performance dictated by manuals, gossip, and the invisible gaze of society. To deviate was to risk ridicule. To comply was to erase one's own desires beneath the expectations of others. Thus, clothing became both a spectacle admired from afar and a cage felt intimately by those within. A paradox in which beauty shone brightest precisely when it was most oppressive. And yet, it is this very contradiction that makes Victorian fashion so hauntingly memorable. It reveals not only the heights of artistic expression, but also the depths of human endurance. The willingness of individuals to suffer for acceptance, admiration, and the illusion of perfection. To study it is to marvel and recoil in equal measure, to see in the shimmer of silk both triumph and tragedy. The spectacle remains in portraits, paintings, and memory, but the prison, the breathless bodies, the aching feet, the silenced individuality reminds us that every era's beauty carries a price, and in the Victorian world, that price was nothing less than health, comfort, and the freedom to simply be oneself. Looking back across the elaborate tapestry of Victorian fashion, it becomes clear that this was an age where appearances mattered more than practicality, where the human body itself was bent, pinched, reshaped, sometimes sacrificed in service to ideals that valued spectacle over comfort and conformity over individuality. Dressing was not a casual act, but a daily ritual steeped in discipline, where men and women alike prepared themselves as though donning armor for battle. Only the battlefield was society's relentless gaze, and the weapons were silks, corsets, starched collars, and plumes of perfume. It was an age in which one could not separate fashion from identity, because to be dressed correctly was to exist correctly, and to falter was to risk humiliation, gossip, and exclusion. For women, every layer carried a story of restriction disguised as refinement. Corsets pressed ribs into fragile cages, reducing breath to shallow gasps. Even as feigning became a strange kind of social performance, crinolines ballooned skirts into cages that filled doorways and caught fire to easily, turning beauty into hazard. Tea-coats added warmth and weight until bodies sweated beneath the burden, while bustles distorted the figure to exaggerate proportions demanded by fashion. Cosmetics, laced with lead and arsenic, masked the face with a toxic promise of beauty, and perfumes, thick with animal musk, cloaked the body in scents that mingled luxury with discomfort. The price of appearing perfect was paid not only in coin, but in health, freedom, and breath itself. Men were not spared by this theater of suffering. Stiff collars and tightly fitted trousers turned movement into restraint. Waistcoats and starched shirts declared refinement, but offered little comfort. Shaving with straight razors left daily reminders that masculinity, too, demanded discipline. Pomade weighed hair into gleaming rigidity, and facial hair was subject to rules as changeable and unforgiving as women's skirts. To appear unkempt was to court suspicion, for every man was expected to sculpt himself into an image of control and composure that reflected the same iron hand of fashion pressing upon women. Beyond the discomfort of bodies, fashion acted as a system of silent communication and control. A gown in morning black, a glove worn or omitted, the scent of a rare perfume, all were signals, declarations of wealth, class, propriety, or availability. Clothing became the visible marker of labor division. The elite flaunted impractical attire that made work impossible, while the working poor trudged barefoot or patched their clothes into submission, revealing by necessity their place in the hierarchy. Even children bore these burdens. The privileged dressed as miniature adults in silks and stiff collars, the poor clad in garments passed down until the fabric itself gave way. The gulf between the glittering spectacle of the ballroom and the harsh simplicity of the factory floor was written most clearly in what people wore. Etiquette bound all of this together in unyielding chains. There were rules for every hour of the day, every kind of visit, every type of gathering. Dinner parties became endurance trials, where guests sat rigidly laced into clothing that denied them breath, even as plates of food arrived in abundance. Balls turned into spectacles of collisions and fainting spells, where oversized skirts spun into chaos, and yet all of it was endured with smiles that concealed the suffering beneath. The calling card system reduced human connection to a series of paper tokens, as if even friendship required a costume. And the ever-watchful eye of gossip made fashion a form of surveillance, where the smallest error could unravel reputations as surely as a loose thread might undo a gown. Taken together, Victorian fashion was a world of contradictions, at once dazzling and suffocating, marvel of artistry and a machinery of oppression. It gave society its spectacle, filling paintings and novels with visions of elegance. But for those who lived within it, the price was heavy. Health faltered, individuality shrank, comfort was abandoned, and all for the fleeting approval of others. Fashion in this age was not simply clothing. It was performance, discipline, and control, a glittering prison whose beauty is haunting precisely because it demanded so much suffering in exchange. And so, as the last candle flickers out on this chapter of history, we are left to marvel at the strange beauty of it all, and to shudder at the sacrifices hidden beneath its silken folds. Victorian fashion was both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that elegance without freedom is only another kind of cage. Thank you for joining this journey into the world of fashion's most bizarre and demanding age. May the images of silks and corsets, gloves and crinolines linger only as echoes of the past and not as burdens of the present. And now, as we close this story, may you rest your mind, set aside the weight of history, and drift gently into dreams. Good night and sleep well.